It is delightful to be in non-sandal weather with you all. I've been able to come back a couple times since I moved, and it's always a strange sensation because everything is familiar, but now sort of slightly askew. Like this place, I know it as Calles y Sueños, and suddenly I come and it's Cultura in Pilsen. It's like doing more or less the same thing, but just slightly different. But it's great to see that there's a crowd here, and it's great to see all of your faces, many of whom I know. The original program for today was going to be a conversation between Rita Indiana and myself. And for those of you who don't have a lot of familiarity with Rita, she is from the Dominican Republic, an extraordinary writer. Some of you may know her because she also did a lot of rock and roll for a while, and she has some really crazy videos on YouTube. We got to know each other, Rita and I, in the last couple years because the University of Chicago Press is going to publish her book, Papi, in March of 2016. And I was honored with doing the translation for it. So we spent about a year working on this. Even though she is not here, I sort of wanted to honor the original intent of the program by reading from Papi first. This is my translation of Papi. Hold on. Wait, technical difficulties. Here we go. Papi is like Jason, the guy from Friday the 13th, or like Freddy Krueger, but more like Jason and Freddy Krueger. He shows up when you least expect him. Sometimes when I hear that scary music, I get really happy because I know he might be coming this way. That scary music is sometimes just Mommy telling me Papi called and said he's picking me up to take me to the beach or shopping. I pretend I don't care. Like I'm sure he's not coming because you don't get told ahead of time if you're going to get your head slashed by a machete. That's why those dummies go straight up to the bushes or the closet where there's a mysterious light spilling out and say, Helen? Or better yet, David? Even though everybody knows it's not Helen or David behind the bushes, but Papi, raising his aluminum softball bat or an axe or a pick. Papi's there, around any corner. But you can't sit down and wait for him because that's a longer and more painful death. It's better to make other plans, to just stay in your PJs and watch cartoons from 6 in the morning until midnight, or even go out for a stroll, which is a game Mommy made up for herself called, If Papi wants you, he can come and find you. But Jason knows better than that, and he disappears for months and even years until I forget he exists, and then the scary music turns into Papi himself honking his car horn, and I go down the stairs 4 at a time so he can make mincemeat out of me just as soon as possible. But what makes Papi most like Jason isn't that he shows up when you least expect him, but that he always comes back. Even when they kill him off. When Papi left for the United States the first time with some Cuban woman who didn't want him sending anybody money, my abuela Silly said, he's dead to me. And when Papi told Mommy he was going to get married again, but not to her, she said, as far as I'm concerned, motherfucker, you're dead. And I think one time when Papi stood me up, I called him on the phone and told him, I hope you die. I imagine there are so many other people who wanted him dead, like Jason, that it wouldn't take a detective to figure out that when it was our turn with the knife, we stuck it in not just once, but a whole bunch of times. And since there were so many of us, and it was so dark, who was going to count? Anyway, nobody ever goes to jail for killing Jason. That's why, when they told me he was coming back, I'd already stopped waiting for him a long time ago and had imagined his return a million times. The clothes Papi would wear, how he'd step off the plane sniffing at the salty air, kneeling to kiss the ground. And then, I'd already pictured this too, how he wears his Nike running shoes and a $2,000 suit, and while the immigration official asks if he's just visiting, Papi gets in a runner's position, his hands on the ground, one leg straight back and the other bent beneath him, and when the stamp falls on his passport, he goes off like a gunshot, running, and his mind runs too, from Las Americas International Airport to La Feria to the front of the National Lottery Building, to his mother's house, just like he promised Gregorio Hernandez, the witch doctor, if only he'd grant him his wish to be rich, and now he's back, and all that money he's been saving has come back with him. Ha! We've been saving up for him, too. We've been waiting for you, Papi. I'm waiting for you on the balcony at your mother's house, at Cili's. I'm waiting for you with clenched fist and my mouth up against the balcony's cold railing, imagining how you're going to leap from the car to the balcony, which is on the 3rd floor, and how you're going to hoist me up and say, I'm so much bigger now you can hardly carry me. But of course, you're always going to be able to carry me. And so you'd lift me up and squeeze me and kiss my forehead, and I bury my head in your neck so I can smell your cologne from over there to see if you've changed colognes, just to see. Everybody already knows you're back, that you're coming home in triumph, a big shot with more gold chains and more cars than the devil himself. Everybody already knows. They're already imagining how you're coming back to them, to every single one of them, and how each one has been waiting for you, fantasizing about it, and telling the whole house, anyone who calls on the phone, the whole neighborhood, hey, he's back. They dream you fill your suitcases with gifts for them, that you work only for them, live only for them. In their dreams, you owe them everything. They imagine your reunion, you in your silver suit, your jet black shoes, running from the airport, or even better, paying for a plane to fly you from the airport to their houses. First of all, to knock on their doors and shower them with green bills that taste like confectioner's sugar. The day comes, and all of them, each and every one, awaken, drench themselves with a bucket of water, and take a good look at themselves. Today is the day when they will know it's good, the day when you'll repay them for all they gave you when you were just a street kid, all those matches they let you borrow, the beer dregs they offered you, the ball bearings from the car engine they let you have. If you have a mental list of each thing that you owe them, and in their heads they write down what you're going to bring them, the thing they think will best repay them. And when the list gets too long, because they've jotted down even the times they said hello to you, they start to borrow, to go into debt, to squander the fortune they already feel is theirs, that fortune that will inevitably illustrate the perfect trajectory of a radiant shitstorm from your pockets to their faces, their hands, their mouths, all over their chests. Your nieces and nephews, cousins, siblings, friends, your siblings' in-law, your nearest and dearest, neighbors, classmates, aunts and uncles, godparents, compatriots, the friends of that guy who's married to the lady whose brother is some dude who graduated from the Navy a year ahead of you. Whew. Now they're organizing, gathering on both sides of the Palm Line Avenue because they all had the same idea of going to meet you. They're prepared with placards in their hands, flags, little signs, banners that say, welcome, welcome. The ones who weren't so quick now climb the palm trees in Avenida Las Americas and pluck them bare so they can lay the green fronds at your feet. Others lay their own bodies down on the asphalt so you can walk over them. Still others come with trucks wired with speaker towers blasting Jose Jose's El Triste, because one night when they offered you some pica pollo, that song was playing and they think it might be a good way to refresh your memory. Still others come in pickups with tinted windows, loudspeakers on the rooftop proclaiming slogans and stories about them and you. Others come disguised as members of the civil defense so that they can shove people around and say, hey, let's move along, waving batons and wearing those little orange vests that you can tell are homemade from a mile away. Then the people finally get organized, and they sign their names in a book some lady is passing around. She also sells peanut brittle. So you can see who came to welcome you and who didn't. The plane can be seen descending, and women start to go into a trance and froth at the mouth while the men, legs trembling post-orgasm, dance El Perrito while holding on to the car bumpers. Then here you are, running right over. People have lined up on both sides of the avenue. A rope keeps them away from your body, but they stretch their arms so you can high-five them without slowing down. You've already doffed that $2,000 suit and are now wearing a $1,700 cobalt blue jogging ensemble. It's starting to rain, and people pull out umbrellas and plastic to cover themselves. Some lackey is just steps behind you with a piece of cardboard so your head won't get wet, but you're sweating so much it looks like you got soaked anyway. Behind you, there's a caravan of cars with sirens, semis, trucks, motorcycles, and scooters. People running and others in wheelchairs and on bikes, keeping you in the spotlight with halogen lights while it rains because it's getting dark. People begin to make out the caravan of driverless Pontiac Trans Ams, replicas Papi brought back to sell, dozens of $5,000 suits brought back for Papi to wear, thousands of watches, chains, white gold rings and necklaces that adjust to Papi's body with a mere thought and that he thinks he'll wear to the grave. Somebody comes up with a baby in his arms so Papi can baptize him. The priest, the mother, and the altar boy with the baptismal font are running alongside him. And somebody kills a pig in Papi's name so a woman can catch up to him and bring a fork to Papi's mouth, and he can blow on that roast pork and then, yum, eat it all up without missing a step. And so they slaughter chickens and goats and guinea fowl all along the way, and running the whole time. Papi takes bites of everything. When a ragged parakeet, who's also running, sings Compadre Pedro Juan, so he'll feel at home, Papi makes like he's dancing, with a hand on his belly and another in the air, wiggling his butt, all the while picking up the pace. But before I can touch him, we see him on TV, slapping high fives from the airport to La Feria, trotting along, turning, trotting, sweating, running, sometimes, and for just a couple seconds, he walks and he puts 2 fingers to his neck and looks down at his watch. Every 2 kilometers, 2 civil defense lackeys hand him a pair of blue Nikes because his soles are wearing out, and the anchor on the 6 o'clock news, with a photo of Papi over his right shoulder, says, Quisqueya's darling son has returned, and they replay the images they shot just minutes before. Papi baptizing the baby, an old woman sticking a piece of pork in his mouth, Papi smiling and holding his hands together above his head like a winner. The screen also shows the cars and chains and an overwhelmed pregnant woman swooning. I go out to the balcony to see if he's there yet, but all I see are the TV station's vans waiting for him, a line of newscasters on the sidewalk, mics in hand, pointing up here. I wave at them from Celi's balcony, and when I go back inside to see if the news can tell us where Papi is, I see myself on the screen, waving from Celi's balcony. One of the things I do at Mills College is teach translation. And I've been doing a lot of translations. I did the translation for Juno Diaz, for Wendy Guerra, for Ana Lucia Portela, a bunch of them in the last few years. And one of the things that has come up in the last couple years is the possibility of building a program at Mills College to teach translation in a low residency format. So if you look on your chair, you have a little flyer about the program. If you're in the least bit interested in translation, or you know somebody who is, send me a note, and I'll do what I can to bring you out to California, where it's really warm. Anyway, I also brought a story of mine to read. The story is pretty new. I haven't read it at all in Chicago, and I think I've only read it once in New York. It's coming out in the spring issue of Prairie Schooner. It's called The Maldives. As soon as I was diagnosed with a brain tumor, I knew I wanted to be here in the Maldives. My tumor is benign, at least technically. Just a little drop of fat, not cancerous. It's growing about 1 centimeter a year, which is about the same as the rising sea level in the Maldives. But this coincidence isn't what drew me to these islands. For me, everything started just before I left Cuba. I'd scored an American visa because my father, who'd escaped years before on a raft, had filed for me under a family reunification provision of U.S. asylum laws. Not that my father had much interest in being reunited with me. When he lived in Cuba, he never hesitated to tell me I was a punishment from God. I'd ask him, for what? What did you do to deserve me? It must have been pretty bad. But he'd just shake his head and walk away. I'm not going to confess to you, he'd spit over his shoulder. Years later, all settled in San Francisco with a new Mexican wife and a revved-up religious calling that involved marching up and down Market Street, passing out pamphlets urging homosexuals to repent. He decided maybe God would be more convinced of his commitment and sacrifice if he saved his own daughter first. And I was ready to be saved. Not from homosexuality, but from the boredom of Havana. Oh, I know. Most Americans hear Havana and think Tropicana and classic cars, parties, and salsa, even though salsa is Puerto Rican. But for a Cuban like me, Havana means living with several generations in a crowded 3-room apartment. In my case, my mother, her boyfriend, my grandmother and her boyfriend, my sister and her boyfriend, my 19-year-old nephew and his boyfriend's 2-year-old son. A job during the day, earning worthless pesos. I was a security guard at the Museum of Fine Arts. And a job at night, earning hard currency. I washed dishes at a fancy family-run restaurant, a position I got by marrying, that's right, marrying the owner, because Cuban law demands that family businesses only hire, well, family. My Havana was dirty and teeming and so loud, it sometimes felt like a piercing in my ears. I honestly could not remember the last time I'd been alone for more than it takes to relieve myself. And even then, I wasn't immune to the soundtrack of screaming and clattering. Given my age, 34, and my situation, I'd already been with pretty much everybody I was going to be with in Havana. And given how overcrowded we were at home, I slept in the same sweat-drenched bed with my nephew, his boyfriend, and their 2-year-old, or weather permitting, on a hammock I'd strung up that ran parallel with a clothesline in the tenement's back patio. I knew nobody was going to move in with me, even if she loved me, and I wasn't sure I brought enough to the table, in spite of my dollar-earning dishwashing job, to be wanted enough to take home. In the few instances when the possibility arose, it was only because the other girls' overcrowded home mirrored mine, but with an additional half-dozen cousins from the provinces. That only left tourists as romantic possibilities. And though my English is fine, nothing calmed my ardor quicker than some American telling me all about the wonders of the revolution as she paid my way into a dollars-only club I would otherwise not be able to afford. In fact, I was celebrating the visa my father had gotten me at precisely one of those clubs, listening to a pretty terrible reggaeton band whose terribleness was underscored by a terrible sound system, when I experienced the tumor's first overt symptom. In an instant, the bass just dropped out of the music. It became tinny and thin. Because the sound quality of all Havana venues, even the very best ones, is unpredictable, I was sure it had nothing to do with me. I was with a bunch of friends, typical Cubans, and a Canadian who was being hustled by one of those friends and had paid for all of us. I shrugged an apology her way, and she smiled uncertainly in my direction. When we left a few hours later, my left ear felt plugged. A loud argument was taking place as we passed a cafe, and a drunk blared a trumpet at the corner, but they sounded gauzy and far away. Oh, I know that feeling. My ears got waterlogged when I went diving in the Maldives, the Canadian said. Everybody nodded as if they knew the exact coordinates of the Maldives, afraid to seem ignorant in front of the Canadian. But I wondered if it wasn't one of those countries where Cuba had sent medical brigades. I was pretty sure I'd seen something in a documentary. Cuban TV is one long parade of documentaries. In any case, I hadn't been diving ever in my whole life, but I did wonder immediately if going deep underwater meant peace and solitude, or if all those schools of fish and shivers of sharks made you feel just as crowded as the city and maybe even a little paranoid. Do you have hydrogen peroxide at home, the Canadian asked. Pour some in your ear. It'll sound like fireworks. Then lay on your side and it'll clear up. But I didn't, and I suspect it wouldn't have even if we'd had hydrogen peroxide. In fact, in the next few days, my hearing seemed to fluctuate wildly. Most of the time, it felt like everything was at a great distance, as if everyone was talking to me from the bottom of the sea. My mother told me she thought it was stress, and that seemed a pretty reasonable explanation. After all, I was leaving soon, headed to the great unknown of the United States, and though I wasn't planning on living with my father, technically I did have to stay with him for 1 year and 1 day because he was sponsoring me. I hadn't seen him in more than a decade. I hadn't heard his voice in almost that long when he'd called out of the blue to say he wanted to save me. My mother said, it must all be happening for a reason. My hearing got no better as I prepped for my trip, but by the time I was ready to go, I must have gotten used to it because I wasn't paying attention to it anymore. Then, as I was getting on the plane, waving at my family, waving at me from the tarmac, My grandmother's boyfriend has a relative who's a high-ranking airport official, so they all got to personally escort me to the plane. I felt a twitching in my left eye. I'd been very sad, especially as I waved at my grandmother, wondering if I'd ever see her again. But I hadn't been able to cry, or more precisely, to cry in any kind of recognizable fashion. My right eye teared up, but my left remained stoic. And now this, little electrical flashes flaring across my eyeball. Because you see, it was in my eyeball, not on my eyelid, not on my brow, but right there, in my eye, as if my retina had developed a tic. For a few minutes, I saw double, and I had difficulty climbing the air stairs and finding my seat. Everyone assumed I was just too emotional to make sense of boarding, but the twitching didn't go away. At customs in Miami, it got so bad I was actually asked by an agent if I needed medical attention. I said I didn't, that I was just nervous about my new life, which my trembling hands seemed to authenticate. What had me genuinely concerned was that my left eye now felt as if someone was constantly opening and shutting a set of blinds. I was supposed to have 2 hours of rest before I caught my next flight to San Francisco, but assuming it was the prospect of seeing my father that had triggered my state, I quickly pulled out my contact list. This is the list that every Cuban has of who they'll call if they ever get off the island, and asked a passenger from my flight if I could borrow her cell phone. I tried to calm down enough to dial. One of the advantages of my worthless museum security guard job was that I got to meet a lot of foreigners, especially artists. They were usually busy proving their proletariat bona fides to the other Cubans, the curators and the collectors who never talked to us, by making nice with guards and janitors and such. That's how I'd gotten to know a video artist named Laura Vaz when she had a one-woman show at the museum. During her installation, it frequently been just her and me through many an afternoon, and I'd proven a good helper and sounding board. Before she left Cuba, she'd given me her number and said to call her if I ever found myself in Miami. "This is who again?" Laura asked after I had identified myself. The volume was up high enough that the phone's owner heard her and looked at me with concern. I told her my name again. "From the museum, in Havana." To my surprise, Laura didn't hesitate once I explained about my father, the avenging Christian, and the way my body had gone into revolt at the thought of seeing him. In about an hour, she was exactly where she said she'd be, at the Starbucks in Terminal D East, just outside the security check. I've never been so relieved in my life. I honestly don't know what I would have done if she hadn't shown up. The flicker in my eye had sped up to about a mile a minute while I waited. Laura greeted me with a familiar hug that far exceeded our island acquaintance, took my single suitcase and drove me to her home, which turned out to be not a palace on the beach, but a small wooden house in Kendall with a garage that served as her studio. I almost asked her what had happened, that I thought she was a successful artist, but I caught myself. She was driving a 2002 Ford Focus station wagon. By Cuban standards, that's practically a luxury car, but I knew, even in the airport parking lot where it was surrounded by scores of newer, shinier cars, that I could only rightfully picture through my one good eye, that I'd probably misjudged her situation. That very night, after setting me up in her guest bedroom, Laura gave me a spare laptop, and set up an account for me on Facebook. She suggested I try to find people I knew in the States. I told her about my contact list, but she said on Facebook all you needed was somebody's name, that I didn't need their phone number or address. I sat at the kitchen table long after she went to bed, one hand covering my jittery eye, and the other typing in name after name of people I knew from Cuba who'd been long gone. I was on an old friends page when I saw some pictures of myself from the very night my ear had started giving me trouble. There I was dancing, though you could see from my expression something was wrong. Then I noticed a Canadian was also in the frame. My friend had tagged her, and I followed the link to her page, where I discovered there was a whole album, 132 total pictures, of her trip to Cuba, including many of places I'd never even heard of, like a beach called Maria la Gorda that had been declared a World Biosphere Reserve by UNESCO. This was a Cuba unknown to me, all parrotfish and blurry hummingbirds, with only the occasional brown arm helping the Canadian onto a boat or serving her and her friends a bountiful meal. I scanned her other albums and saw she was quite the world traveler, swimming with green turtles in the Philippines, with moray eels in the Solomon Islands, and walking along what appeared to be a beach at night with blue-white stars scattered in the sand, as if the sky had emptied a constellation on the shore. I wondered if my eye was playing tricks on me. The caption read, "Ostracod crustaceans, kind of like bioluminescent phytoplankton, lighting up the shore in Mudu Island in the Maldives. I thought, wow. I stayed up close to dawn searching for more photos of this strange phenomena, but mostly finding image after image of beaches and beach towns in the Maldives, little storybook villages with an infinite span of blue-green water surrounding them, the sky an endless and tender light. Nothing looked crowded in the Maldives, and even in the capital city of Male, houses were wreathed by gardens of blue and orange flowers, hammocks everywhere. Best of all, of the approximately 1,200 islands that make up the country, and I say approximately because the number of islands depends on the season, only about 200 are inhabited, and only half of those have tourist resorts. Honestly, I couldn't figure out why UNESCO hadn't declared all of the Maldives a World Biosphere Reserve. The next day, I opened my eyes and everything was in perfect focus. The ceiling fan above Laura's guest bed, the floral print on the duvet, the giant black screen on the wall with its blinking red light. It took me a second to remember where I was: the United States, Miami, the home of someone I barely knew. And then I heard a low bass throbbing through the wall and the sharp knock of Laura's knuckles on the bedroom door. Adelante, I said, and in she came with a tray holding a glass of orange juice, a banana, a stack of pancakes, and a small cup of black coffee with a full head of foam. "You won't get service like this every day," she said, "but today being your first day in America." I almost said something about America being the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, but gratitude shut me up. Instead, I asked her to make the picture of the glow-in-the-dark beach in the Maldives the wallpaper on my new laptop. In truth, Laura Vaz turned out to be an exceptional friend. When I further explained my situation, including that I wouldn't have a green card or a work permit for a year and a day, she got on the phone and found me a job, washing dishes at a restaurant owned by some friends of hers who paid me in cash. She also got me odd jobs with other artists packing work for shipping. I wasn't making a ton of money, but enough to buy a bus pass, go to a movie now and again, and buy groceries and creams for my chapped hands. Then Laura said she was going on a fellowship to London for part of the year and would have to pay someone to house sit if I hadn't shown up. My free housing would continue, so even though I was sending money to my family every month, I was even able to start saving. I did get a cell phone pretty quickly, and I did eventually call my father and thank him for getting me out of Cuba. He was furious with me, accused me of using him just to come over, but I made no effort to explain how I'd gotten sick just thinking about living with him. Part of it was that, as time had passed and my vision and hearing returned to normal, it was hard to believe my symptoms hadn't been psychosomatic, and I just didn't want to give him that kind of power. In spite of having my new cell, I didn't make other calls. I knew people in Miami and Key West and Tampa, but I actually didn't want to see anyone. I folded up my contact list and put it away. Laura's house was blissfully quiet. All I ever heard were little warblers up in the palm trees and the mailman lifting the letter slot in the afternoon. My bed, which Laura constantly apologized for because it was only a single, felt as long and wide as a luxury liner to me. Initially, I had tried to pay Laura back for her kindness by cooking and cleaning, but she got upset, said she was gaining weight, and that she liked to take care of her stuff herself. I was terrified I'd offended her, so I just tried to stay out of her way and holed up in the guest room. I watch a lot of TV on the big screen in my room, especially documentaries, including The Island President, about how the Maldives are disappearing due to rising sea levels caused by climate change. The Maldivian president wants the world to learn a lesson from his country's predicament. He wants the world to take responsibility. The situation is so bad, they've even got a sovereign land fund to buy new territory and move once their country's submerged, like Alexandria and the pyramids of Yonaguni in Japan, or like Guanacabibes, an underwater city off Cuba's western shore, except no one who isn't Cuban actually thinks it's a city, but just a bunch of geological anomalies. As soon as Laura left for London, I ended my self-imposed exile in the guest room. I opened every door in the house and danced from room to room. What splendor to open my arms wide and just feel cool, satiny air conditioning on my skin. What an extravagance to take a hot 40-minute shower in the morning and a cool hour-long bath at night. I walked around naked and whistled and even did cartwheels in the living room. I thought for sure I'd grow lonesome at some point, but I didn't. I got plenty of human interaction at the restaurant and on the bus. Every now and again, I'd run into someone I knew, and when I evaded their questions, they assumed I was either having a mysterious affair with a rich American or spying for Cuba. One night at the restaurant, I was loading the dishwasher and singing along to a new song by Calle 13 when suddenly somebody turned off the radio. "Hey," I said, "come on," as I reached for a pair of latex gloves to tackle the pots. But the music didn't come back on. I walked over to the radio and turned up the dial, and almost immediately one of the owners swatted my hand away. He was saying something. His mouth was moving and his face showed irritation, but I couldn't hear a thing. I shook my head, but the bubble tightened. Suddenly, I could only see him through what appeared to be a fisheye lens. He grabbed me by the shoulders and brought his face close to mine, but I couldn't understand him. Before I knew it, the other owner, a Panamanian guy who'd been trying to set me up with his 52-year-old sister since I'd arrived, threw me in his Jeep and drove me to the emergency room at Jackson Memorial Hospital. We were there until dawn, and he stayed with me the whole time, occasionally squeezing my hand and bringing me something to eat and drink. The ER wasn't much different than Cito Garcia in Havana, except that the electricity didn't go out the whole time we were there. Otherwise, it was the same defeated faces, the same resignation to whatever fate had just ordained by fall or accident, or in my case, a sudden short circuit. They found the tumor when they did an MRI on my brain. It sat dead center of my skull, shaped like a 2-inch comma and leaning heavily to the left. It had wrapped itself around my auditory nerves so as to practically strangle it. It was also big enough to damage both cranial nerves 4 and 5, which explained why I'd had double vision and couldn't tear up. What they couldn't tell me was why I was having hearing loss in both ears. They needed to run more tests. Unless I did something, they said, via notes the Panamanian wrote out in his boxy script, both my hearing and vision would slowly deteriorate. They talked about surgery and radiation, experimental medicines and treatments like CyberKnife and auditory brain implants, all of which I could never afford. The restaurant didn't offer health insurance, and I would have been ineligible anyway, waiting for the year and a day when I would have my U.S. residence and my work permit. I wasn't dying, and I wouldn't die from this tumor, they told me, but left alone, it would eventually leave me trapped in my own body. After the Panamanian took me home, I sat in Laura's expansive living room and thought about my predicament. My father would tell me this was a punishment from God for all my sins, for all the women I'd briefly loved. My mother would tell me it was destiny, that there are forces in the universe greater than us that we simply must obey. Was there anything to learn for anyone from my situation? Who would take responsibility for me? I got myself a beer from Laura's fridge and counted my money. I had saved about $8,000. I was considering buying a ticket back to Havana, knowing with that money my family could probably take care of me for a very long time. I had no illusions about my condition being relieved in Havana. Certainly, I would get medical attention. I would be visited by caring doctors. But I knew Cuba simply didn't have the equipment or expertise to help me, and I didn't want to have brain surgery at a hospital where the power went off and on without regard to what was happening on the operating table. I opened my laptop to send an email to an acquaintance from the museum who had agreed to relay messages to my mother in case of emergency. When I saw my wallpaper, that blue-white constellation across the coastline in the Maldives, I knew time was of the essence. I might not ever hear the waves lapping the shore, but my vision, at least for that moment, was again as good as a high power Leica lens. When I searched for one-way tickets to Male, I found they were within my reach. In the weeks following my arrival, I found a job washing dishes. I figure I can do that, or maybe gardening, until my eyes fail. Then I will sail to one of those islands where no one goes, and lay myself down in all that phosphorescence. I will sink into the firmament of the Maldives, 1 centimeter at a time, and let the waters rise, lifting me, guiding me through the silent dark to my own Atlantis.
Hand in the back there is going to help me out, and we'll ask you to come up here to this mic and ask your question. Anybody?
I'm good.
I have a question then. I never get to ask a question. This is cool. My question's on your translation program that you started. Do you have any recommendations for people who want to practice translating aside from taking a paper and literally translating, any techniques to work on that?
A really good thing to do is to take texts that have been translated more than once and to sort of do comparisons, to sort of study the differences in translations if you don't actually want to do some quick translations yourself. Because when you're talking about translation, you're really talking about translation into English. That's mostly how translation programs work, especially in workshops. So that's a great way to sort of compare how people render different things and sort of figure out what you would do. It's a nice way to do that. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, I was really starting to get into the reading. I didn't want to stop you. It was the clock that made me stop
That's
you.
all right. It's all right. It's all right. We're good.
Do you want to keep?
Oh.
Do you want?
Can we read the rest of your story?
I'm
So
sorry.
actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to repeat it in the mic just for the camera. Where can we find the rest of your stories?
There's my stories. This is the story was complete. This is coming out in Price Schooner in the spring, which is a literary journal, pretty easy to find, actually. I have a collection of short stories called We Came All the Way from Cuba So You Could Dress Like This that came out in '94 and is still in print, and there are e-editions. I'm putting together a new collection of short stories, probably be out next year with Akashic. This will be one of the stories in the book. Trying to think, a bunch of stuff has been getting published. I'm sort of drawing a blank right now. Oh, and one of my novels is available for sale here, Days of Awe. Yeah. I have a webpage, and usually when I get something published, I throw it up there. So that or on Facebook.
Anyone else? If you don't mind coming up to the microphone.
Looks like you have a question.
I'm trying to find it. Actually, this question. Hi, that was wonderful. But this question was for the poets. I wondered if you wrote in Spanish, since it was in Spanish, and then translated it, or if you wrote in English, or how that all worked.
Well, I originally wrote mine in English. It did have some Spanish words in the English version, and then I just translated it into fully Spanish.
I was reading this really interesting article that was doing brain studies on bilingual people. I don't really remember the science of it because I'm not a neuroscientist. But they were saying how people who are bilingual growing up speaking two languages or having to juggle that think in a completely different way. So it's almost like they're speaking a third language in their head. And I mean, I kind of have that sensation when I write about migration specifically, because a lot of the emotions and scenes that I'm seeing are their own thing. And I chose to write it in English because I kind of wanted to speak in the voice of somebody who was patrolling the border or being rude, like, can't see those kinds of people at night, they don't belong here, that kind of stuff, yeah.
Just really quickly, I also wrote mine in English with a couple of Spanish phrases sprinkled in. And I think that the parts where some of us use Spanish are to be more authentic to how it would feel and how it would sound, right? So when I had that line of "Mujer, you're dragging us down," or like little things like that, I think it does make a difference when you say it to people. And when my mom was telling me these stories, right, this is how she was saying it. But yeah, I've been translating for at UIC for our professor interviews from Spanish to English. And it's such a mind trip because I'm really translating like 50-page documents of translation, and it's conversation. So conversation there's so many ways that you can translate. O sea, luego pues.
Yeah, it's so idiomatic, yeah.
Right, and so, yeah, I'm intrigued to learn more and to hear more about that later.
Oh, well, there you go. You have a question?
Hi again. I wanted to ask you a question about truth in writing, because a lot maybe it's the way you read it and it sounds sincere. So I take it as you reading your own story, and I want to know how much of that is you, and how much you think that a piece of writing has to be true to the author's own life experience.
Good question. I think most fiction writers sort of part from, something in their lives. I mean, for the most part, I think that, you don't just randomly get an idea. Something has to hit you. Something has to come your way, pass by your screen, something to get your attention and then your interest. So there's always some of that. And, I think every book I've ever written, there's some element of me in the story. In this case, the element of me is pretty different. I mean, I'm not, a Cuban lesbian in my 30s dying for silence. I'm a Cuban lesbian who's about to turn 60, and I'm happily married and have a 4-year-old son. So my life and that life are very, very different. But what prompted the story is that last year I was diagnosed with Meniere's disease, which is a hearing loss disease. And it also has a lot of vertigo and tinnitus and hyperacusis and stuff. I don't have the vertigo, but I have the hearing loss. So in the process of reading about hearing loss, obviously, when something like this happens to you, when it happens suddenly, and when you're somebody like me who has spent, a career, listening to people and then bringing that to the page, who's very dependent on hearing, and someone who loves music and who did music criticism for many, many, many years, the prospect of losing my hearing is a big deal. And also my son is 4, I think it would probably be different if my son was 16, and I'd had 16 years of hearing him and interacting with him in voice, And a lot of people say, well, you can always learn ASL. And I'm thinking, sure, of course, and I will. But the fact of the matter is that because I'm almost 60, my universe is made up of hearing people. And, you and I may become great friends, but you're not going to learn ASL just to talk to me. So I have to find ways to contend with my hearing, and I have to find ways to adapt and to deal with, what is essentially a disability. And so I've just been reading tons of stuff about what causes hearing loss and, all these different things. Meniere's is a very mysterious disease. They actually call it a syndrome, which is the medical giveaway that they don't know what the fuck is going on. And so, there are a gazillion theories. Some people say it's viral. Some people say it has to do with bone adjustment, and perfectly reasonable medical journals. These are not like some guy named John in Arizona, and so it just has put me into very different kind of space for information gathering, and I began to sort of think of it that way. Also, I realized that it's very rare, especially in queer literature, but across the board, really, to write about disability, to read about disability. Disability is a real, is a real, absent thing, and yet, something like a third of Americans have some kind of disability. But we either think about it very individually, or we don't think of it as disability, and so it just becomes some silent part of who we are. So that's where the interest in this sort of came about. Yeah.
Great. Well, we've actually wrapped up our time, so I invite you again to go back and purchase a book if you're interested. We do have another program that starts here at about 2 o'clock, so you're welcome to join us for that too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for sharing your work. Really appreciate it.